Continuing in Report from Iron Mountain, we are in Section 6, Substitutes for the Functions of War, and this is Video 3. It might be argued that a well-armed international police force operating under the authority of such a supranational court could well serve the function of external enemy. This, however, would constitute a military operation, like the inspection schemes mentioned, and like them would be inconsistent with the premise of an end to the war system. It is possible that a variant of the unarmed forces idea might be developed in such a way that its constructive, i.e. social welfare, activities could be combined with an economic threat of sufficient size and credibility to warrant political organization. Would this kind of threat also be contradictory to our basic premise? That is, would it be inevitably military? Not necessarily in our view, but we are skeptical of its capacity to evoke credibility. Also, the obvious destabilizing effect of any global social welfare surrogate on politically necessary class relationships would create an entirely new set of transition problems at least equal in magnitude. Credibility, in fact, lies at the heart of the problem of developing a political substitute for war. This is where the space race proposals, in many ways so well suited as economic substitutes for war, fall short. The most ambitious and realistic space project cannot of itself generate a believable external menace. It has only been hotly argued that such a menace would offer the last best hope of peace, etc., by uniting mankind against the danger of destruction by creatures from other planets or from outer space. Experiments have been proposed to test the credibility of an out-of-our-world invasion threat. It is possible that a few of the more difficult to explain flying saucer incidents of recent years were in fact early experiments of this kind. If so, they could hardly have been judged encouraging. We anticipate no difficulties in making a need for a giant super space program credible for economic purposes, even were there not ample precedent. Extending it for political purposes to include features unfortunately associated with science fiction would obviously be a more dubious undertaking. Nevertheless, an effective political substitute for war would require alternate enemies, some of which might seem equally far-fetched in the context of the current war system. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons of the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. Poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water supply is already well advanced, and at first glance would seem promising in this respect. It constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organization and political power. But from present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, will be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a possible basis for a solution. It is true that the rate of pollution could be increased selectively for this purpose. In fact, the mere modifying of existing programs for the deterrence of pollution could speed up the process enough to make the threat credible much sooner. But the pollution problem has been so widely publicized in recent years that it seems highly improbable that a program of deliberate environmental poisoning could be implemented in a politically acceptable manner. However unlikely some of the possible alternative enemies we have mentioned may seem, we must emphasize that one must be found of credible quality and magnitude if a transition to peace is ever to come about without social disintegration. It is more probable in our judgment that such a threat will have to be invented rather than developed from unknown conditions. For this reason, we believe further speculation about its putative nature ill-advised in this context. Since there is considerable doubt in our minds that any viable political surrogate can be devised, we are reluctant to compromise. by premature discussion any possible option that may eventually lie open to our government. Sociological. Of the many functions of war we have found convenient to group together in this classification, two are critical. In a world of peace, the continuing stability of society will require 1. An effective substitute for military institutions that can neutralize destabilizing social elements, and 2. A credible motivational surrogate for war that can ensure social cohesiveness. The first is an essential element of social control. The second is the basic mechanism for adapting individual human drives to the needs of society. Most proposals that address themselves explicitly or otherwise to the post-war problem of controlling the socially alienated turn to some variant of the Peace Corps or the so-called Job Corps for a solution. The socially disaffected, the economically unprepared, the psychologically uncomfortable, the hardcore delinquents, the incorrigible subversives, and the rest of the unemployable are seen as somehow transformed by the disciplines of a service modeled on military precedent into more or less dedicated social service workers. This presumption also informs the otherwise hard-headed ratiocination of the unarmed forces planned. The problem has been addressed in the language of popular sociology by Secretary McNamara. Even in our abundant societies, we have reason enough to worry over the tensions that coil and tighten among underprivileged young people and finally flail out in delinquency and crime. What are we to expect where mounting frustrations are likely to fester into eruptions of violence and extremism? In a seemingly unrelated passage, he continues, "It seems to me that we could move toward remedying that inequity of the selective service system by asking every young person in the United States to give 2 years of service to his country, whether in one of the military services or in the Peace Corps or in some other volunteer developmental work at home or abroad. We could encourage other countries to do the same." Here as elsewhere throughout his significant speech, Mr. McNamara has focused, indirectly but unmistakably, on one of the key issues bearing on a possible transition to peace, and has later indicated also indirectly a rough approach to its resolution, again phrased in the language of the current war system. And that ends Part 3 of Section 6, Substitutes for the Functions of War, and we will continue with this section. It'll be Part 4, and hang in there. Don't go away. This book is not very long. It'll only take a couple more days to get through it.